Ladies and gentlemen, as the shadows lengthen and the chill wind whispers through the ancient oaks, allow me to draw you into a realm where the veil between the living and the spectral grows perilously thin. Tonight, we embark upon a journey through the macabre history of the Thornton family, a sinister tale that coils like a serpent through the annals of forgotten lore, where piety twists into peril, and confessions become chains that bind the soul. Imagine, if you will, a lineage forged in the crimson soil of remote hamlets, where tobacco fields stretch endlessly under a brooding sky, and the spires of isolated Catholic houses pierce the heavens like accusatory fingers. I in the shadowed hollows of rural Virginia, where the red clay clings to the roots of ancient oaks and the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth and curing tobacco, the Thornton family first took root. It was a land forgotten by progress, a place where the nearest town lay a day's ride away, and the world beyond felt like a distant rumor carried on the wind. Here, in the late 18th century, amid fields that stretched like blood-stained seas under a perpetually overcast sky, the Thorntons emerged not as mere farmers or landowners, but as something far more insular, far more potent, a clan bound by blood and an unyielding devotion to a faith that bordered on fanaticism. The progenitor, Elias Thornton, arrived in these isolated valleys sometime around 1782, fleeing the clamor of Philadelphia's burgeoning Catholic communities, where Enlightenment ideas threatened to dilute the old ways. He was a stern man, tall and gaunt, with eyes like polished obsidian that seemed to pierce the soul. Elias brought with him a young wife, Mary, pale and silent, who bore the weight of 7 pregnancies in as many years, though only 3 children survived the fevers and hardships of frontier life. They settled on a tract of land granted through obscure ecclesiastical connections, a parcel nestled between rolling hills and dense forests that swallowed sound and light alike. It was here that Elias built the first Thornton manor, a sturdy brick edifice with narrow windows like watchful eyes, surrounded by tobacco rows that demanded ceaseless labor and offered scant reward. But it was not the soil that truly defined the Thorntons, it was their fervent Catholicism, practiced in isolation with a rigor that would have alarmed even the most devout in Rome. In an era when Catholic families in Protestant-dominated America often kept their faith subdued to avoid persecution, the Thorntons embraced it openly, almost defiantly. Elias constructed a private chapel on the estate, a stone structure hidden partly by overhanging willows, where daily masses were held long before any priest made the arduous journey from Baltimore. The family became self-sufficient in their piety, teaching Latin to their children from crumbling missals, reciting the rosary at dawn and dusk, and observing feasts with a solemnity that bordered on the theatrical. Whispers among neighboring Protestant farmers spoke of strange lights flickering in the Thornton chapel late into the night, of chants carried on the breeze that sounded more like incantations than prayers. This religious fervor was no mere personal solace, it was the forge in which the family's identity was hammered. Elias instilled in his offspring, 2 sons, Jeremiah and Ambrose, and a daughter, Constance, a belief that they were chosen, set apart by God in this wilderness to preserve the true faith untainted. The isolation amplified this conviction. Cut off from broader society, the Thorntons intermarried with distant cousins who shared their zeal, or occasionally brought in brides and grooms from far-flung Catholic enclaves, ensuring that bloodlines remained pure and secrets stayed buried deep. The red clay fields, stained rust by iron-rich soil, became a metaphor for their world, unyielding, marking everything it touched, and hiding what lay beneath. Tobacco was their livelihood, a crop that thrived in Virginia's humid embrace but exacted a toll on body and spirit. The Thorntons oversaw enslaved laborers in the early years, a practice they justified through convoluted theological arguments, claiming stewardship rather than ownership, though the whips and chains told a different story. As generations passed, the family transitioned to sharecropping and later mechanization, but the fields remained central, a vast, monotonous expanse where workers toiled under the watchful gaze of Thornton overseers. The tobacco barns, with their dark interiors reeking of fermented leaves, became places of quiet dread, where accidents befell the disobedient and rumors of ghostly apparitions kept the living in line. The isolation bred a peculiar intimacy among the family members, one laced with intensity. Meals were taken in silence broken only by readings from the lives of the saints, and evenings devoted to examinations of conscience that delved into the minutest sins. Children grew up knowing every contour of the estate, the hidden paths through the woods where wild hogs roamed, the crumbling family cemetery tucked behind the chapel, its headstones etched with Latin epitaphs and symbols that seemed older than Christianity itself. This enclosed world fostered a sense of superiority, a belief that outsiders were profane, tainted by the world's corruptions. Yet beneath the veneer of piety lurked the seeds of something darker. The fervor that bound them also blinded them, turning devotion into obsession. Elias's iron rule set the pattern. Obedience was paramount, questioning forbidden. His sons inherited not just the land but this unyielding mindset, passing it down like a cursed heirloom. In the red clay fields, under skies that rarely cleared, the Thorntons cultivated more than tobacco. They nurtured a legacy of control, where faith became the justification for dominion over others, and isolation the perfect veil for what was to come. As the 19th century dawned, the family expanded their holdings, acquiring adjacent plots through means that neighbors murmured were less than honorable, foreclosures on indebted farmers, marriages that conveniently consolidated land. The manor grew, wings added in Gothic styles that clashed with the original simplicity, towers rising like sentinels over the endless rows of green leaves. Religious artifacts accumulated, reliquaries said to contain fragments of saints' bones, ancient crucifixes that seemed to weep in the candlelight. The Thorntons' Catholicism evolved into something uniquely their own, a private rite infused with local superstitions, the fear of haints in the woods, the belief in signs and omens read in the flight of crows or the patterns of smoke from the curing barns. This was the foundation, the sinister soil from which the Thornton tree would grow twisted branches. In their rural fastness, amid the red clay and tobacco, they built not just a home but a kingdom unto themselves, where God's will was interpreted solely through their lens, and the outside world was held at bay. It was a beginning steeped in fervor and seclusion, a cradle for the horrors that would unfold as confessions turned weapon, betrayals festered, and the line between salvation and damnation blurred into oblivion. And so the tale darkens, drawing us deeper into the shadows that the Thorntons cast so very long. I in the dim-lit chapel of the Thornton estate, where candle flames danced like wary specters upon the altar and the air carried the faint tang of incense mingled with the earth's red clay, the family's dominion truly began to twist into something profane. It was here, in the sanctity of the confessional, a wooden booth carved with intricate crucifixes and veiled by heavy velvet, that the Thorntons discovered a power far greater than the acres of tobacco they commanded. Elias Thornton, the patriarch, had ordained his eldest son Jeremiah into the priesthood through discreet arrangements with sympathetic bishops in Baltimore, ensuring that the family's spiritual needs would never require an outsider's ear. This was no mere convenience, it was a deliberate forging of chains, invisible yet unbreakable, binding the souls of those who toiled under the Thorntons' rule. The workers, sharecroppers descended from freed slaves, poor white tenants fleeing the mountains, and immigrant families lured by promises of steady labor, came to the chapel not just for Sunday Mass but for the sacrament of penance, compelled by the Thorntons' unyielding expectation. In this isolated realm, where the nearest proper parish lay miles beyond rutted roads, confession to Father Jeremiah or, later, his brother Ambrose, who followed him into holy orders, became obligatory for any favor, a loan of seed, an extension on rent, or even permission to marry. The confessional, meant in orthodox teaching as a vessel of divine mercy, was perverted into an instrument of surveillance and subjugation. Penitents knelt in the shadowed kneelers, whispering their frailties, adulteries born of loneliness, thefts of meager rations to feed starving children, resentments harbored against overseers' cruelty, and Father Jeremiah listened, his face impassive behind the grill, absorbing every secret like the red clay absorbed rain. These confessions were never truly sealed in the Thornton chapel. What was whispered in supposed sanctity became currency in the manor's shadowed halls. Elias and his sons gathered in the study after vespers, poring over ledgers not just of crop yields but of human weaknesses. A worker who confessed envy toward a neighbor might find his plot reassigned, justified as a lesson in humility. One who admitted a fleeting thought of flight from the estate could expect closer scrutiny, his movements watched by loyal retainers. The Thorntons rationalized this blasphemy through their distorted piety. They were stewards of souls, guiding the flock with a firm hand, preventing sin from festering unchecked. In their minds, the sacred seal was a privilege for the worthy, and they, as God's chosen in this wilderness, stood above such constraints. Outsiders were profane, their secrets, tools for the greater good of the family's eternal order. As the generations turned, this twisted practice deepened its roots. Jeremiah's successor, his nephew Father Lucius Thornton, refined the art of manipulation. He would probe gently during confessions, his voice a soothing murmur laced with feigned compassion, drawing out details of debts, illicit loves, or grudges against the family itself. "Tell me everything, my child," he he would urge, for only in full unveiling can absolution descend. Yet absolution came conditionally. A penitent burdened by guilt over a stolen tool might be assigned penance that conveniently benefited the estate, extra labor in the fields, perhaps, or testimony against a troublesome neighbor. Women, in particular, bore the brunt. Confessions of marital discord or forbidden desires were wielded to enforce obedience, threats of exposure veiled as pastoral concern. Your soul hangs in peril, Lucius might intone, unless you heed the path of submission. This empire of fear expanded beyond the workers to ensnare distant kin and even rival landowners. Marriages were arranged with confessions in mind, brides vetted through whispered admissions extracted from relatives. Land disputes were settled not in courts but through leverage gleaned from the booth, a neighbor's confessed fraud used to force concessions. The Thorntons amassed wealth not solely from tobacco but from this subterranean web of control, foreclosing on the vulnerable, binding them in debts moral and material. The chapel, once a place of solace, became a vault of terror, its confessional a throne from which the family priest dispensed judgment disguised as mercy. Yet this perversion carried its own poison. The priests themselves, steeped in the hypocrisy of their role, grappled with unraveling consciences. Father Ambrose, in his later years, was said to pace the chapel aisles at midnight, murmuring prayers for forgiveness he dared not seek from another, haunted by the secrets he had weaponized. The workers whispered among themselves in the barns, their fear tempered by a growing resentment that simmered like fermenting leaves. Outsiders who chanced upon the estate spoke of an unnatural hush during confessions, as if the very walls absorbed the words only to regurgitate them in twisted form. Through this profane appropriation of the confessional, the Thorntons forged an empire built not on faith but on fractured trust, where divine forgiveness was counterfeit and human frailty the mortar of their power. Secrets, meant to liberate the soul, became shackles, binding generations in a cycle of dread that would one day demand reckoning. And in the flickering candlelight of that isolated chapel, the line between confessor and tyrant blurred irrevocably, setting the stage for the betrayals that would follow. As the Thornton Empire swelled upon its foundation of pilfered secrets and enforced silence, the very instrument that had bound others in fear began to gnaw relentlessly at the bonds of blood itself. The cascade of betrayals that unraveled the family did not arrive with thunder or accusation. It seeped in slowly, like damp rot through the floorboards of the old manor, fed by the weight of unspoken truths and the poison of absolute power. What began as a unified front of piety and control fractured along the fault lines of human frailty, jealousy, ambition, lust, and the quiet terror of knowing too much about those who shared your name. The first great rupture came in the generation of Father Lucius Thornton, whose skillful wielding of the confessional had elevated the family's dominion to its zenith. Lucius, ordained in the estate's chapel with all the solemnity of a cathedral rite, had taken a vow of celibacy that the world outside might have honored, but within the insulated walls of the Thornton domain, vows were bent to the family's will. It was whispered, though never proven, that Lucius had developed a particular attachment to a young cousin, Eleanor, brought from a distant branch of the family to marry his younger brother Clement. Eleanor's confessions, tender and unguarded, revealed a heart torn between duty and a forbidden affection for the priest who absolved her. Lucius, intoxicated by the power of her secrets and his own suppressed desires, crossed the line that even the Thorntons had hitherto respected. Their liaison, conducted in the shadowed sacristy after late-night devotions, produced a child, officially passed off as Clement's firstborn, but bearing the unmistakable obsidian eyes of the priest. Clement, a layman consumed by resentment at being forever in the shadow of his clerical brothers, suspected the truth almost from the cradle. He listened to the hushed conversations of servants, noted the lingering glances during family prayers, and felt the sting of Eleanor's quiet aversion. Yet he said nothing for years, biding his time while the child, named Raphael, grew into a favored heir, groomed for both land and possible priesthood. The betrayal festered in Clement like an untreated wound, twisting his devotion into something darker. He began to drink heavily in the tobacco barns, seeking solace among the workers whose secrets his family had long exploited. There, in moments of inebriation, he let slip fragments, hints of the priest's hypocrisy, murmurs that the great Father Lucius was no better than the sinners he condemned. The unraveling accelerated when Raphael, now a young man of 20, confessed to his uncle Father a crisis of faith. Tormented by visions and a growing conviction that the family's practices were an abomination, he sought guidance in the very confessional that had birthed so much misery. Lucius, panicked at the prospect of his sin exposed by his own flesh and blood, did the unthinkable, he violated the seal openly for the first time in Thornton history, warning Clement of Raphael's doubts and suggesting the boy might need correction. Clement seized the moment. In a confrontation fueled by years of suppressed rage, he accused Lucius outright in the manor's grand parlor, before the assembled family, Eleanor weeping silently, the elder matriarch clutching her rosary as if it could ward off the truth. The revelation shattered the fragile unity. Accusations flew like shards of broken stained glass. Lucius defended himself with righteous fury, claiming divine dispensation for his actions. Eleanor, cornered, admitted the affair in a voice barely above a whisper. Clement reveled in the destruction he had wrought. Raphael, hearing the truth of his parentage from shouting voices rather than gentle revelation, fled into the night, vanishing into the dense woods that bordered the estate. His disappearance was the first of many vanishings, a harbinger of the madness that would claim others. Spirals of suspicion now infected every interaction. Siblings who had once shared examinations of conscience now eyed one another warily, wondering whose secrets might next be weaponized. Clement's wife, long aware of his growing instability, began to fear for her own safety, confessing her terrors to a younger priest cousin who promised discretion but quietly informed the patriarch. Clement, sensing the net tightening, descended into paranoia, barricading himself in the east wing with bottles of corn whiskey and a loaded pistol. Nights echoed with his ravings, curses against the clergy and the family, threats to burn the chapel and its damning records. The betrayals multiplied. A sister, long marginalized, revealed ledgers showing how Lucius had siphoned estate funds to silence potential scandals. Another brother, passed over for inheritance, produced forged documents claiming primacy. Family gatherings devolved into tense standoffs, prayers recited through gritted teeth. Madness claimed Clement fully in the end, found hanged in the tobacco barn he had once haunted, a note clutched in his rigid fingers accusing the family of collective damnation. His death was ruled suicide, but whispers persisted of assisting hands, of a mercy killing disguised as despair. Younger members, raised on the tainted milk of this legacy, began to fracture in subtler ways, nervous disorders, hysterical fits during Mass, nights spent wandering the halls murmuring to unseen accusers. The once impenetrable Thornton facade cracked wide, revealing the rot within, a family that had preyed upon the weaknesses of others now devoured by its own. Trust, the rarest commodity in their isolated world, evaporated entirely, leaving only suspicion and the hollow echo of prayers that rang false even to those who uttered them. And so the cascade continued, betrayal begetting betrayal, madness weaving its threads through the bloodline like the roots of some poisonous vine, choking the life from what had once been an empire of fear. The Thorntons, architects of others' ruin 558, found themselves ensnared in the very webs they had spun, hurtling toward the crumbling estates and lingering curses that awaited. As the betrayals carved deep fissures through the Thornton bloodline and madness claimed its toll in hushed suicides and midnight wanderings, the physical world that had sheltered their sins began to mirror the decay within. The once proud estate, sprawling across the red clay hills with its Gothic additions and watchful towers, surrendered inch by inch to the relentless advance of time and neglect. What had been a fortress of control now stood as a monument to ruin, its crumbling walls and overgrown paths concealing generations of sinister deeds beneath layers of dust, ivy, and deliberate oblivion. Faded portraits in the grand hall gazed down with eyes that seemed to follow the rare visitor, their painted faces frozen in expressions of stern piety that masked the horrors etched into the very bones of the house. The manor itself, expanded ambitiously in the 19th century with wings that jutted like broken limbs, showed the first signs of surrender after Clement's death. Repairs ceased as inheritance disputes fractured the family's unity. No single Thornton commanded the resources or will to maintain the vast structure. Rain seeped through slate roofs patched inadequately decades earlier, staining plaster ceilings with dark blossoms that spread like bruises. Wallpaper, once rich with patterns of vines and crucifixes, peeled in long strips, revealing lath beneath and, in some rooms, cryptic markings scratched into the wood, names, dates, fragments of Latin prayers that hinted at desperate vigils in the night. Windows, narrow and leaded, cracked under the pressure of settling foundations, allowing wind to whistle through like the sighs of the unrestful dead. The chapel, heart of the family's perverted power, fared worst of all. After Raphael's disappearance and the scandal that followed, masses grew infrequent, then ceased entirely when the last ordained Thornton renounced his vows in a letter burned unread by the matriarch. The stone structure, half swallowed by encroaching willows, accumulated pigeon droppings on its altar and moss upon its steps. The confessional booth, that instrument of so much terror, stood with its door ajar, velvet curtains rotted to threads where moths had feasted. Inside, the kneelers bore the faint impressions of countless penitents, and rumor held that on certain fog-shrouded evenings, whispers could still be heard, echoes of confessions long past, or perhaps something less natural seeking release. The family cemetery, tucked behind the chapel in a grove of ancient cedars, became a place shunned even by groundskeepers. Headstones tilted at precarious angles, eroded by acid rain and the passage of seasons, their inscriptions barely legible. Some bore symbols not found in standard Catholic iconography, interlaced circles, inverted crosses hastily recarved, hands clutching broken rosaries. Beneath the earth lay not just bodies but secrets, unmarked graves for those who had vanished, infants born of forbidden unions, workers who met untimely ends in the fields. Night-blooming flowers, planted perhaps in mockery or penance, cast their heavy perfume over the plot, attracting fireflies that danced like will-o'-the-wisps above the mounds. Portraits in the long gallery told their own tale of decline. The earliest, of Elias and Mary Thornton, retained some vigor, stern faces rendered with care by a traveling artist from Richmond. But as generations progressed, the quality diminished. Later works, commissioned cheaply or painted by family members with limited skill, captured subjects whose eyes held a haunted quality, whose mouths twisted in expressions that suggested knowledge too burdensome to bear. One portrait in particular, of Father Lucius in his priestly vestments, had been removed from its frame and hidden in the attic after the scandal, only to be rediscovered years later with the eyes gouged out, by whom, no one would say. Dust accumulated thick upon the remaining frames, softening features until ancestors seemed to recede into the canvas, retreating from the present they had shaped so darkly. Lesser buildings on the estate mirrored this decay. Tobacco barns, once bustling with curing leaves, sagged under rusted tin roofs, their dark interiors home to bats and the faint, lingering scent of fermentation. Sharecropper cabins, abandoned as labor moved elsewhere, collapsed inward, porches caved and windows staring blindly at the overgrown fields. The red clay itself seemed to reclaim what the Thorntons had wrested from it, gullies forming where once orderly rows of tobacco flourished, earth sliding down hillsides to bury fence lines and stone walls. Yet the crumbling was not merely physical, it was deliberate in places, an attempt to bury evidence. After the last major scandal, a cousin institutionalized for raving about family curses, remaining Thorntons systematically destroyed records. Ledgers detailing confessions leveraged for gain vanished into hearth fires. Diaries hinting at unspeakable acts were torn and scattered. The manor's library, once boasting rare theological texts and family chronicles, suffered a mysterious blaze that consumed half its shelves, leaving charred remnants that smelled of kerosene even decades later. Those few family members who lingered into the 20th century inhabited only a fraction of the house, clustering in the least decayed rooms while sealing off wings with heavy padlocks. They spoke little, even to each other, and received visitors with suspicion that bordered on hostility. Portraits were turned to face walls, as if the ancestors' gaze had become unbearable. The estate became known locally as a place to avoid after dusk, where lights flickered in windows long boarded shut and shadowy figures moved along paths overgrown with kudzu. In this atmosphere of deliberate neglect and creeping ruin, the Thornton legacy calcified into something between tragedy and warning. The crumbling estate stood as testament to hubris, the belief that secrets could be contained forever, that power built on others' frailties would endure. Faded portraits, with their gouged eyes and dust-veiled faces, seemed to watch the final unraveling, silent witnesses to a dynasty that had devoured itself. And in the quiet hours, when wind rattled loose shutters and owls called from the cedars, the house appeared almost alive with the weight of what it concealed, generations of sinister deeds pressing down upon the present, demanding acknowledgement even as the last stone settled into decay. The Thornton name, once spoken with fear and respect in the surrounding counties, faded into obscurity, surviving only in whispered tales told by firelight, stories of a family cursed by their own darkness, whose grand estate now stood as a mausoleum for sins too numerous to confess. And beneath the ivy-choked walls and behind the blind windows, the shadows lengthened, waiting for the final Thornton to draw breath before claiming the house entirely. In the hushed aftermath of collapse, when the last Thornton heir drew a final, rattling breath in a nursing home far from the red clay fields, the macabre legacy did not dissolve into oblivion as one might hope. No, it lingered, insidious and persistent, a cautionary whisper from the past that slithered through time's darkened corridors, touching lives long removed from the estate's crumbling embrace. The Thornton tale endured not in grand histories or official records. Those had been meticulously erased or buried beneath layers of deliberate forgetfulness, but in the oral traditions of the surrounding counties, passed down like a forbidden heirloom around flickering hearths on autumn nights when the wind howled through the oaks like tormented souls. Locals spoke of it in lowered voices, warning children to steer clear of the old Thornton road after dusk, lest the lingering curse claim another wanderer. They recounted how the family's sins, the perversion of sacred trust, the betrayals that splintered blood ties, the madness that drove men to hang from barn rafters, had impregnated the very land, seeping into the soil like the iron that stained it crimson. Tobacco planted on former Thornton fields yielded bitter leaves, they said, cursed with a flavor that brought misfortune to those who smoked it. Sharecroppers who dared till the overgrown plots reported tools vanishing, shadows moving against the wind, and dreams plagued by accusatory figures in clerical garb, their eyes hollow with unspoken judgments. The estate itself, now a hollow shell swallowed by kudzu and time, became a magnet for the curious and the foolhardy, urban explorers from distant cities, ghost hunters armed with electromagnetic gadgets, teenagers seeking thrills on dare-filled evenings. Many emerged pale and silent, speaking of cold spots that defied explanation, of whispers echoing in the chapel's ruined nave reciting fragments of Latin confessions, of portraits whose gouged eyes seemed to weep afresh in the flashlight's beam. One tale persisted above others, that of a young historian in the 1950s who, researching Catholic enclaves in Virginia, chanced upon scattered Thornton documents in a diocesan archive. Driven by scholarly zeal, she visited the ruins, spending nights transcribing faded inscriptions in the cemetery. She returned changed, afflicted by nightmares of confessions that were not her own, driven eventually to abandon her work and retreat into seclusion, murmuring of a family that watched from beyond the grave. Similar fates befell others, a developer in the 1970s who planned to raze the site for subdivision, only to suffer a string of misfortunes, bankruptcy, family tragedies, that forced abandonment of the project, a photographer whose images of the interior captured orbs and apparitions that no lens should reveal, leading to institutionalization. Yet the legacy extended beyond mere hauntings. In a broader sense, the Thornton served as a somber parable, a whisper cautioning against the hubris of wielding power over others' souls. In quiet moments, elders invoked their name when speaking of unchecked ambition or the dangers of secrets hoarded too long, the way piety could mask predation, how isolation bred monstrosity. The story echoed in sermons delivered from pulpits far removed, anonymous anecdotes illustrating the perils of spiritual arrogance. It influenced local folklore, blending with tales of haints and curses common to the region, ensuring that the Thornton name, though faded from maps and registries, retained a spectral potency. Even as decades rolled into centuries, fragments surfaced unexpectedly, a reliquary unearthed by plows, bearing the family crest, a diary page fluttering from a hollow tree, ink bled but legible enough to chill the finder. These relics, quickly hidden or destroyed, reinforced the sense that the past refused interment. The macabre legacy became a living caution, a reminder that some darkness, once unleashed, coils eternally through the corridors of time, waiting to brush against the unwary. And so the Thornton tale persists, not as mere history, but as an enduring specter, a sinister echo reminding us that the frailties we exploit in others may one day return to claim our own descendants, binding them in chains forged from the very darkness we thought contained. The cautionary whisper grows faint with each passing year, yet it never fully silences, carried on the wind through those ancient oaks, a perpetual murmur from the past that the corridors of time, vast and unforgiving, will never allow to fade entirely.